When an innocent dog is left to his fate, he'll make it his mission to find the juiciest steak to steal and cause chaos everywhere he goes. And that's why today, in Flick Summary, Caramelo. The movie opens with a small puppy being abandoned on the side of the road in the streets of Sao Paulo, in beautiful Brazil. Confused and with no idea of what to do, the little dog wanders around until he makes it to the city and looks for something to ease his hunger. In the distance, a restaurant is seducing him, displaying rows of roasted chicken he can't wait to sink his teeth into. The problem is, he needs to cross the street to get to where the banquet awaits. Yep, that's lots of traffic. Now, listen. Allow me to ease your mind. The dog doesn't die. That much I can tell you. So don't be crying just yet because we haven't gotten to the emotional part of the movie for now. And also, he doesn't get named until the mid part of the movie. But we already know his name is Caramelo, so we're just gonna call him that for the rest of this recap. Back to the scene, Caramelo makes it to the other side of the street and looks in awe at the juicy food right in front of him. He waits for someone to feed him, but upon seeing that no one takes pity on his hungry soul, he does what any other dog would do in his place. He steals the food and runs away as fast as he can. 3 years go by, and Caramelo has now grown into a full-on troublemaker, causing mischief wherever he goes, from chasing guys on bikes to stealing food whenever he gets the chance. And not just any food, our boy has a delicate taste. We now meet Pedro, a sous chef at a very prestigious restaurant in Sao Paulo, getting ready to welcome an important food critic that very same day. Pedro is out on the market trying to get a special kind of beef the chef will need so he can cook the critic a special dish. Just as he's ordering the meat, he spots Caramelo stealing some sausages from the vendor, but instead of telling on him, he helps him get away with it. As Caramelo tries to leave, he is met with a group of strays that look anything but friendly. Outnumbered and with no other choice but to run, Caramelo drops the loot and tries to escape the big German shepherd that begins to chase him. And just when he's cornered and about to face a bloody fate, Pedro appears and saves the day. He's leaving the market and back to the restaurant on his pickup, where Caramelo jumps to protect himself. Pedro is of course clueless about the stowaway hiding there, but he somehow feels a presence and keeps on looking at the back, which ultimately leads him to almost running over a dog walker who will be important to the story in just a bit. Finally, at the restaurant, and before opening hours, Pedro starts cooking some food without realizing Caramelo savoring what he's making from afar. There, we meet Paula, Pedro's co-worker and friend, asking him to start living his life and do more than just being in the restaurant day and night. They have a brief conversation where Pedro explains he wants to pitch Ivan, the chef, and also a very grumpy man, his coxinha, a very tasty Brazilian snack to get added to the menu. Now here's the thing, a coxinha is typically found everywhere in Brazil. So to add it on the menu of a restaurant that serves rare dishes such as these doesn't really make a lot of sense. Yet Pedro keeps his hopes up. The restaurant finally opens and the team starts working to serve the clients. But in the middle of the shift, Pedro gets a strong headache and walks out to take some pills. There, Caramelo awaits and gets into the restaurant's kitchen without Pedro realizing. Meanwhile, the female version of Anton Ego has arrived and is waiting for her food. Now, am I the only one who notices the resemblance between these two characters? Or are all food critics supposed to look the same? Anyway, Ivan is almost done making Laura's dish, but just as he's getting ready to send it out, Caramelo has no better idea than to sprint toward the dish and help himself to the beef. In all fairness, the sausage he stole earlier that day got stolen by a pack of bullies, so you gotta cut him some slack. The poor boy was hungry. The staff chases Caramelo around the kitchen, but it's Ivan who finally catches him, ready to give him a good smack. Fortunately, Pedro steps in just in time, saving Caramelo from the chef's fury. This causes Ivan to get into a verbal fight with the owner of the restaurant, going all Gordon Ramsay on her, throwing a tantrum and quitting his job right in the middle of the shift. Now chefless and with Laura waiting for her food, Martha, the owner of the restaurant, finds herself clueless as to what to do next. But Pedro steps in and commands the team so they get out of the pickle. Problem is, Caramelo, now outside, ate the last beef needed to cook Laura's dish. So, Pedro comes up with a quick solution and ends up making her a coxinha. Laura is weirded out by the simplicity of the dish and claims to be surprised at the lack of creativity, demanding to see the person who made the coxinha. Now in the dining area, Pedro talks to Laura, who asks if he was responsible for serving that snack in a restaurant of high prestige. Pedro nods and tells Laura his mom used to make that for him when he was a kid, so he reinvented it to honor her. Next up, Laura takes a bite, and though we don't see much of what happens after, I can only assume it went something like this. Yep, she loved it. So much so that Martha made Pedro the new chef and agreed on having coginha added to the menu. The shift is finally over and Pedro is the last one to leave. But as he exits the restaurant, he is surprised to see Caramelo outside waiting for him. Up to this point, Pedro has zero intentions of adopting him. But hey, it was because of this furry little friend that he got to become chef and include his favorite dish to the menu. So, he gratefully gives him some food and goes back to his place. Thing is, just as he is preparing to sleep in the middle of the heavy rain, he hears loud barks coming from the street. Neighbors start complaining, and when he goes out to see who's responsible for all this noise, yeah, you guessed it, Caramelo. He had somehow followed Pedro back to his place and was determined to stay with him one way or the other. Pedro is touched by Caramelo's resilience and decides to let him in to spend the night. But as soon as he opens the door to his flat, the devilish stray makes a mess of his home. He gets on the sofa while wet, bites on his cushion, eats his food, and despite Pedro's efforts to teach him to be a good dog, not that he could do that in a couple of minutes, Caramelo continues to cause chaos. Pedro gets another headache, but brushes it off and goes to sleep, only to wake up to a complete makeover of his flat, courtesy of Caramelo. As if that weren't enough, Caramelo also pees on his bed and leaves a fresh brownie on the floor for Pedro to step on. Surprisingly, he keeps his cool, but it's not until Caramelo tears off a sleeve from his brand new chef's apron that he decides the dog has to go. Pedro takes him to a shelter that's coincidentally run by the woman he almost ran over the day before, Camilla. There, he gets another headache and is told by Camilla to visit a doctor, as she believes Caramelo feels there's something wrong with him. Unfortunately, she was right. Pedro gets into an MRI machine and is then told by his doctor that he's got a brain tumor, and to make matters worse, a cure seems unlikely. Now picture this, you're 27 years old, finally landed the job you've always wanted, and you're just beginning to live your life when suddenly, you're told it might be coming to an end. Well, that's exactly what happened to Pedro. In shock and unsure of how to proceed, he leaves the doctor's office and goes straight to the restaurant where, distracted and unfocused, ends up cutting his finger and burning the food. Martha walks into the kitchen to ask if everything is okay, and Pedro makes up an excuse as to why he's not focused, saying he stayed up all night working on the new menu and that he needs to be away for 2 weeks to finish it off. Martha seems reluctant to the idea, but finally agrees when Paula decides to take over. Now out of the restaurant, Pedro listens to a voice message from his mom and wonders how to break the news to her. But he can't find the courage to do so and goes back to the shelter where he decides to take Caramelo back to have him as company during his battle with cancer. They bond quite quickly, and though Pedro tries to teach Caramelo how to behave, it just doesn't work. He remains a very messy dog, but still lovable as hell. So much so that even his neighbors become fond of the little one. And how could they not, if he even joined the church chorus to sing? The following morning, Pedro leaves Caramelo in his neighbor's care before heading to the hospital to begin his first round of chemotherapy. While there, he meets Leo, perhaps one of the kindest souls I've ever seen in a movie. He's got cancer too, but unlike Pedro, his isn't in the brain, but rather in...
Ter só uma bola não faz muita diferença não, cara.
Well, at least he's got a great sense of humor. They start talking and Leo explains that it's all in the mind and the way to deal with something this terrible is to stay positive. And trust me, Leo is as positive as it gets. Pedro gets a call from his mom but refuses to answer, making Leo realize he hasn't told anyone. So, to cheer him up, Leo gives him a little flip book, one that ends with a silly joke about his balls being safe. Cut back to Pedro's apartment, we find his neighbor exhausted and defeated by Caramelo's misbehavior, promising to never take care of the dog due to his demonic nature of destroying everything in his path, Bible included. Another day goes by and we are now taken to the shelter where Camila and her friend are struggling with bills and facing eviction for being 4 months behind on their rent. But Pedro comes to the rescue, bringing Caramelo in to be educated and of course willing to pay for it. From this point on, the movie moves forward with Pedro living his life, working on the new restaurant menu, training Caramelo with Camila, attending his chemotherapy sessions, spending time with Leo, and finally visiting his mom. He still hasn't found the courage to tell her about his illness and starts imagining how badly she might take the news. So once again, he keeps it to himself and, instead of breaking the news, he chooses to spend the day cooking with her. Pedro then takes Caramelo to the beach where they spend some time playing together, until Caramelo's mortal enemy appears on scene and taunts him while attached to a bunch of balloons? Yeah, Caramelo's nemesis is an inflatable shark. This really doesn't add much to the plot, but it sets up a later scene where we see Caramelo dressed as a shark, and hey, I thought it was cute. So there. We're now back at the shelter where Pedro invites Camila and her friend to the restaurant's gala night so they can try out the new menu he had been working on during the past 2 weeks. Camila is slowly getting involved with Pedro, but knows nothing about his illness yet. However, that's about to change. They attend the restaurant, and though it all seems to be flowing smoothly initially, things take a turn when Pedro notices his hair falling off and discovers he's losing his taste and is unable to notice when food is too salty. This causes him to have a panic attack, faint, and be rushed to the hospital. There, Camila pretends to be his wife to be allowed inside and ultimately finds out Pedro has cancer. He has no choice but to come clean and tell Camila the treatment didn't work. The tumor has grown and he's scheduled for surgery a week from that day. The chances of him dying are high, so he asks Camila to please take care of Caramelo if he doesn't make it and then leaves her behind. The following morning, Leo shows up at Pedro's place to cheer him up and gives him a heartfelt pep talk, reminding him that nothing's decided yet and he still has 6 days to live his life to the fullest before surgery. They then head out into the city and spend the day painting graffiti on a wall, their way of leaving a mark on the world. As the day comes to an end, Leo gives Pedro another flipbook, this time filled with illustrations of Caramelo, and with a powerful message in the end. More lively, Pedro goes back to the shelter to check on Camila and discovers they've been given 1 month notice to vacate the premises if they can't pay the debt. Though it is not his problem, Pedro decides to help Camila to avoid this from happening and tells her he'll come up with something to keep the shelter afloat. They then go to an amusement park where his hair starts falling off and ultimately allows Camila to cut it off completely. They finally kiss and move things to the bedroom where Pedro's all like,
"Say my name."
The next morning, Pedro builds up the courage to visit his mom and tell her the bad news. She bursts into tears and hugs her son before they get into the kitchen to cook together one more time. Pedro then asks her mom to borrow an old food truck she had laying around, and with Leo's and Paula's help, they bring it back to life to set up a business to raise money to pay the shelter's debt and prevent the dogs from going homeless. Pedro's idea is to sell both coginhas and dogginhas as soon as they're done remodeling the truck. Pedro drives it to the shelter and surprises Camila with it, explaining his plan and getting her hopes up. The morning after, he goes to the hospital to visit Leo and brings him a coginha, but finds out he passed away the night before from a pulmonary embolism. There, he also discovers Leo's cancer hadn't been responding to chemotherapy in years, but it was his optimism that kept him going. Leo had a feeling he could go at any moment, so he left Pedro a heartfelt letter that, I'm not gonna lie, made me cry while I was on a plane. Another day goes by and Pedro has set up the food truck and is ready to sell his coginhas to help save Camila's shelter, but not before honoring Leo's memory and dedicating his work to him. Some hours go by and no one comes around to buy a single coginha, but that changes quickly when Pedro's neighbors show up and suddenly a lot of people are buying food for their dogs. The business is such a success that even Laura, the food critic, pays him a visit and tells him she'd be happy to invest. The day finally comes to an end and Pedro asks Camila to head home while he stays behind to clean the food truck with Caramelo. But just as he is preparing one last meal for his furry friend, another headache hits and he collapses, lying unconscious as the truck bursts into flames. Caramelo won't stop barking, and when no one comes to help, he takes off running, chasing after Camilla, who's already gone. But along the way, he steps on a piece of glass, injuring his paw. And listen, I'm not gonna lie, that scene made me yell out loud while I was on the plane on my way back home from Brazil. And to make things worse, I was down on E at that moment. So you can imagine how I was feeling when I saw that scene.
No! No!
Gosh, I figured the woman sitting next to me might have been looking at me like this. Caramelo manages to warn Camilla about Pedro being in danger, so she goes back to the food truck and makes it on time to save Pedro, then rushing him to the hospital, where doctors decide to move the surgery up to take place in the next 2 hours. Pedro knows he might not make it, so he asks to see Camilla one last time, but the hospital refuses. Not willing to give up, Camilla finds a way to sneak Caramelo in before the surgery by releasing all the shelter dogs into the hospital to distract the medical staff. We are then taken to a scene where Pedro is already being sedated, and then a few seconds of uncertainty. He made it! Pedro survives the surgery, and right after, we see the next months of his life unfold, as he marries Camilla, has a kid, and finally manages to teach Caramelo how to behave. 12 years pass and Caramelo is now old, but still surrounded by love. Though we don't see him dying, the film closes with him and Pedro at the beach, already old and tired, but enjoying his favorite thing. The end. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing and let me know which movie I should do next. See you next time.